Tomorrow Ashes. The major races of Vera recently returned to the world to the Divine Gate to establish themselves again after millennia of initially fleeing the calamity that brought destruction and corruption to their original home. Today I'll be covering the major and playable races of Vera and Ashes of Creation. Before I jump into the different playable races in the game, I just want to provide a little bit of context on how races will work in Ashes of Creation. The important thing to remember is the races do not just provide a flavor of a race that you might play, but also provide gameplay changes like your initial base stats. So the stats are provided on a base level by your class, which will then be changed based on the different archetype or class that you end up picking. Additionally, the race that you pick will provide you with unique gameplay changes in the form of the augment system to change the way you actually play. So there's a lot more to the classes than just fluff. Each race is divided into factions, which might contain one or more versions of that race that culturally differ. The Vaylun and Klaw humans call the Aylin Empire home and are collectively known as the Aylin. A resilient yet time-worn empire that has become weak over the years due to disunity. The emperor is elected and as such doesn't really wield much power from the look of it. They are the single largest population on Vera and stand to gain a lot by having a unified power within their actual domain. Build, order and civilization is what the Klaw humans thrive on. As the largest empire in the old world, they plan to do the same with the new settlements on Vera. These humans have very clear French, medieval and European influences, but with a large diversity that takes place within their culture itself. I expect this race to be basically the master of none but jack of all trades kind of race, which you would choose if you're unsure as to what direction you want to go in when starting to play the game. The Vaylun, the other playable sub-race of humans in the game, are formed by the desert and forged to trade, law and hardship, and this is the pillars of their existence. Originally from the wealthy empire of Sanctus, these humans are all about expanding their wealth and as such influence within the world. With Middle Eastern themes, the housing and architecture that this race has is very reminiscent of what you would find in the Islamic kingdoms from the Middle Ages, with very colorful roofs and other ways to make the actual environment seem less hostile than it actually is. I would expect them to be very similar to their Aylin cousins, but with the same time having bonuses to trade and unique traits around that. My favorite part about this race is the aesthetic of their armor and cosmetic gear that they actually have, which is very appropriate to the harsh and hot climate that you would find in desert regions. Moving on to the more fantastical races, let's jump into the Orcs, or Kai-Vek Orcs as they are collectively known as. Originally a very nomadic and tribal society, the Kai-Vek, or two groups, the Vek and the Ringkai, combined and conglomerated together to allow them to individually pursue their actual goals. The Vek specifically pursuing a more spiritual and celestial academic pursuit, and the Ringkai trying to look out for expansion and conquering the world. In more recent times, though, their leadership have taken a more pacifist approach, trying to get along with their neighbors in different ways, whether it be trade or just general relations. They retain their tribalist ways, and I expect a lot of violence and rituals to take place within this society specifically. The Ringkai, which is one of the two sub-races of the Kai-Vek Orcs, believe that they must retain power through focus and control. However, this does not mean that they cannot become enraged. Enraging in combat might actually make them more powerful and more fearsome foes in the process, when it does actually end up happening. And with the motto honor, power and tranquility, there's quite a bit of depth and a bit of contradiction within their actual culture. While not officially stated, I can see very many Japanese as a little bit of Mongol influences within the society. And that makes for an interesting mix, because the Japanese are also about honor, power, and tranquility, but their expansionism and tribal nature is more reminiscent of the Mongols or nomadic tribes of Asia. The Ringkai are also much larger than their Vec cousins, so I'd expect them to have very good physical stats in terms of strength or defense or vitality in some form. I'm very much hoping that the enrage that the wiki actually talks about is part of their class or rather race mechanic that adds to combat in some form or another. Moving on to the smaller and less combative orcs, the Vec are a Mesoamerican influenced race. Their focus is celestial, purpose, and fate, meaning that they are more stargazers than they are combatants. This might make them better mages in game, or just more interesting to play from a more scholarly or as artisans. Preferring to sit back and pursue prophecy, fates, and the secrets of the world, the Vec appears to be more isolationist, preferring to observe the world rather than take part. As such, I'd expect their stats to be more along the lines of intelligence or knowledge in some form. I am a huge fan of the Mesoamerican cultures, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and so on. So I'd probably be gravitating towards this race, even though I normally don't play scholarly classes in MMOs. The stocky dwarves are next. These fall under the umbrella of the oldest nation in Verra, or what used to be the oldest nation in Verra, and that used to rule over the northern mountains, under which a great mysterious source of magic was, that provided them power of untold means. The Dunir make up the bulk of the Dunzinkel dwarves, as a race that prefers to live in the mountains and delve deep. Their motto is stoic, tradition, and forge. Pound for pound, they are considered one of the strongest warriors in the world of Verra. However, they're being tiny in the first place, there's not a lot of pounds to begin with. These dwarves take inspiration from the Nordic cultures, and you can see it in their actual hovels and buildings. Yes, they aren't currently actually populating the mountains because they have just landed through the Divine Gates and are starting to repopulate their own culture within Verra. Later on, though, we might see them populating mountains and a slight shift in their architecture itself. If the Dunir follow dwarf convention, I can expect them to have the highest vitality in the game and the most physical defenses as a result. My favorite bit of flavor for this race is that the Dunir and not their Nukua cousins are the only ones with facial hair. So in other words, fabulous beards will only be present within the actual Dunir section of the dwarven races. Females will also have beards. I wonder if they'll be different and more interesting. That brings me to the Nukua, which, for all intents and purposes, are completely different than the dwarves you might expect. These guys draw influence from the Polynesian cultures found within the Pacific. They prefer the coasts where they can perform what's called the Great Hunt, which doesn't have much information around it, but it sounds like a really cool racial flavor that they might have. They go by the motto family, freedom, and courage, and retain the craftsmanship that you would expect from dwarves. I adore the fact that they're bringing in Polynesian kind of inspiration into the game, which isn't something we see a lot in media, and they're implementing it in a way that actually makes it seem natural to the world itself. Next up we have the Pretty Boy Elves, which fall under what's known as the Imperion and the Pyrion Empire. A society of scholars and artists, the Pyrion Empire is almost as old as the Dinzinkel dwarfs. They coexisted with their neighbors, the human Aylins, until a conflict broke out. A deadly conflict, one of the deadliest ever to be found on Verra. Since then, they prefer to stick to their woodland borders, and relations between them and their neighbors have been strained. The race of Imperial Elves have global imperial ambitions, and this is a new concept to the Elven society. However, with a highly structured and centralized government and an elite military force, they might just be able to fulfill these imperialist ambitions and expand outside their forest borders. With the motto Imperial, Pride and Culture, you can expect this race of elves to have a very big effect as an antagonist in this world of Vera. This faction of elves have a Greek and Roman influence, so expect a lot of structure behind everything they do, whether it's their day-to-day building or their way of running things within their government or culture itself. In terms of gameplay, the Pyrion Elves might be a little bit unclear at this stage as to what they could possibly provide in terms of stats and racial abilities. I'm hoping there might be something like the humans, but a bit more dexterous in the process. Don't expect these elves to be like wood elves or more nature focused. That moves on to the Pyrion Rai, which I hope I'm saying correctly, which is the more nature orientated elf race. Nature, balance and fury is what the Pyrion Rai believe in. Nature will have its way, brings fury and balance depending on what's needed. The Pyrion Rai take inspiration from the Native American tribe of the Navajo. As such, they have a very much a nature aspect to them. I expect these guys to be the extreme of the dexterous and agility type of gameplay. So we're going to see a lot of ranged classes using this actual this race. Some of the concept art distinctly reminds me of Lothlorien from the Lord of the Rings world, and it's quite beautiful, but it's a bit contradicting to some extent. A small but appreciated touch is that the Pyrion Rai will be capable of having brown skin, which is pretty unique in terms of gaming, because usually it's either a very fantastical green or blue, or the standard white color that you would expect from your European skins. Finally, we make our way to the unique race that every single MMO has. This one is called the Talnar. When the calamity befell Vera and the other races fled the world, the Talnar's ancestors, a mismatch of all other major and minor races, decided to stay behind and were eventually forced underground, and managed to avoid the widespread corruption the calamity brought. Not much is known about them, but we will eventually be able to play a mammalian or a reptilian type of Talnar, one being a more furry type of thing and another being a more scaly. The Talnar are not a unified force and don't actually have a running government or nation of any kind. Instead, they just kind of rule under the underworld and small pockets of where they actually might exist. Unlike the other races of Vera, due to their history, they actually have a different starting point than the divine gateways that the other races have. Instead, they come up from the underrealm and are looking to repopulate the surface, which is now more free of corruption. Interestingly, they are planned to be the most customizable race, so you'll be able to make way more changes and unique characters by using this template. In terms of gameplay, I have no idea how this might affect the actual stats that you might have, because at the end of the day, this is a massive mix of dwarves, humans, elves, and various other minor races that all come together and intermingle at the same time. So what that means in terms of stats might be that you're actually able to customize the stats even to a more specific level. It does look like their architecture and environment will be very much similar to what you would find in caves with bioluminescence, mushrooms and kinds of stuff like that, which you can probably see on your screen right now. Other than that, there isn't really much more to say about the Talnar. We'll have to know more by Alpha 2, but at the end of the day, I am still excited for it because of the customizability that you'll end up having. That about wraps it up for my race coverage. Yes, it was very simplistic with mostly just some imagery to get you guys going. There isn't much more to discuss that isn't specifically lore related, which I hope to get into later when I have more information. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Remember to subscribe if you enjoy the content and you want to make me keep doing this.